We are only a couple of days into Season 4, so it is still a bit too early to come out with the conclusions of this patch, but what it's good to go for right now is at the very least to see the direction that players are taking at the start of this season, in what have been their choices in what to play, and how the results initially have been so far. Of course, they can still shape up to be a little bit differently as time goes on, for example, as most players will get their hands on their actual tier set of the season, for example. In a couple of weeks, most players will also have access to their first bullion reward, so their first best in slot, likely trinket, will also be a thing, their second crafted item at max item level, etc, etc. So for now, we still have the entry level results of the beginning of this patch, which is still good enough to go and take a look for, both from a raiding perspective but also a Mythic Plus perspective. These are the current results so far at the beginning of this season in Mythic Plus. You can see definitely some new entries in terms of performance when it comes to the high end of results so far. Demonology Warlock and Beast Mastery Hunter have been doing decently well up to last season, but definitely not this well as they have been doing right now at the beginning of Season 4. You also have Destruction Warlock being higher than usual. Even Shadow Priest has gained a little bit. Of course, who is losing if all of these specs are gaining something are Red Paladin and Havoc Demon Hunter. The biggest of the gains so far in terms of damage is, surprisingly, Marksmanship Hunter, who is doing very well. This is for the DPS. For the tanks, no real surprise there in terms of damage, besides Blood Death Knight now being much higher up compared to before, and what is also less surprising is Holy Priest, after Holy Priest has been buffed multiple times in their damage now right off the gates at the beginning of Season 4. They have quite the high damage. It's also worth pointing out that none of these healers right now are actually going to be getting a new tier set. So they still have the Season 3 version of their tier set. So nothing will change for them in terms of their performance when it comes to damage, in terms of the mechanics they will gain from their tier set. It's gonna be more interesting, of course, to see the differences when it comes to DPS based on the specs actually changing their tier set in this season. And it is a funny sight because when it comes to DPS, up to all of the first top 5 results right now, every single one of these specs is actually not changing their tier set. So in this season, even if they replace their current tier set with the new one, they will still have the Season 3 set bonuses. The first ones on this list who actually do end up changing something are Shadow Priest, going back to their Season 2 tier set, and Destruction Warlock, going back to their Season 1 tier set. These are the major changes when it comes to the performances right now when it comes to DPS. You can also look at the very preliminary meta to compare it with Season 3, the last week of Season 3, to see the differences. Of course, this is not that special, especially when you compare it with other seasons. It's not that rare to see the beginning of the new season as well as the last week of the previous season to be vastly different compared to what has been going on for the majority of the season. Even going from Season 1 to Season 2 and then from Season 2 to Season 3, you had many changes in popularity of multiple specs. In here, actually, we don't even see nearly as much as we thought, because yes, Vengeance is losing out, but not nearly as much. This is the least surprising one. Everyone was already on board with Vengeance being the strongest tank, and basically no balance tuning was given to tanks, so you can still expect Vengeance to do well. Red Paladin was the biggest performer of the season overall as a DPS and was not nerfed, which means predictably they continue to be by far the most popular of the choices when it comes to DPS, and also the other ones of the popular picks, whether it is Shadow or Fire or Outlaw, have remained amongst the more popular ones. It is expected though at the start of the season, especially when the key level is still low. Remember, we have been lowering down the keys by a lot. This is the equivalent basically of a 19 right now. So as soon as we start getting into the 12 to 13 key level range, many of these numbers will get more focused on fewer number of picks. Like, for example, the divide we have right now between Warlocks being quite even might eventually be squeezed into only one of the two Warlock specs. Same goes for the two Mage specs being played right now, etc, etc. Healers are currently the most diverse we have ever had. Of course, it will likely only last for a couple of weeks, but for now, every healer looks like they are trying Mythic Plus, of course. They want gear, they want upgrades, the key level is still reasonably low, so you have plenty of options and choices amongst all of these specs. The predicted meta for the season still hasn't changed for now. You are still expecting Mistweaver to be the main option together with Resto Druid and with Priest, and then varying based on the composition of your group. If your group, as possible, as likely, as expected, will contain a Shadow Priest, it's gonna be a hard life for the healer priests to make a spot in the group, because running with a double of your same class is not a very popular choice in Mythic Plus. So if Shadow stays popular, the more likely options for healers go to Mistweaver and Restoration Druid. Then it will depend on whether or not Retribution Paladin stays meta for the combat rest, which likely leaves more room for Mistweaver, and then lastly the maximum cope option of the lack of Bloodlust amongst DPS, giving more value to both Restoration Shaman and Preservation Evoker. This is right now the situation after only, a couple of days of Mythic Plus. But what about also the raid? The raid does give us some differences in the performances, because if we compare them to Mythic Plus, we would be expecting a couple of the Hunter specs, Demo, Ret, Shadow, even Outlaw to be performing very well. One of the major differences is that now you also have Unholy Death Knight performing very well together with Fury Warrior, which are not doing nearly as well in Mythic Plus. So in a more single target focused scenario like a raid, they are doing much better. This is for now where we have more parses available, which is heroic, of course, because after only a couple of days you have more options to see the performances from heroic results. The one asterisk in terms of performance are the confirmed bugs right now to the tier set of Devastation Evoker. To whoever already has the new updated tier set complete, is currently bugged and doing about 12% less damage than it should, as well as a couple of the Assassination Rogue's abilities not having an updated damage in this season. As far as the popularity goes, we have some familiar faces like Ret, Beastmastery, and Havoc being amongst the more popular ones. What might be more surprising, though, is Devastation. We might have mentioned this to be the case in this season, but Devastation is significantly more played right now compared to, well, basically the last season. If we compare it with the popularity of Augmentation, right now at the beginning of this season, Devastation is beating Augmentation in terms of popularity. Now, as mentioned, we don't have nearly as many results when it comes to Mythic when it's this early, but we can still see similar results. We can still see, similar to Mythic Plus, both of the ranged Hunter specs being towards the top, Shadow Priest as well as Outlaw, as well as Demonology and even Windwalker, which are what we are seeing basically here. We also know Havoc is not nearly as effective on single target as they are in AoE, where they excel more in Mythic Plus, so it's more understandable to see them doing worse at the beginning of this season. Out of all of these results, much like in Mythic Plus, what is perhaps the more clear difference is Ret, right? Not nearly as much in Mythic Plus, they are still doing very well in terms of damage in Mythic Plus, but not nearly as much of a dominant force as they were up until a week ago. And in the raid, it is also somewhat visible. This is how we ended 10.2.5 in Mythic. Amir Josil and Ret was chilling at the top. This is quite far back to how the patch actually began and the few buffs Ret Paladin received, starting with also the legendary being far more easily available to Ret, and then actual buffs to the spec itself, compared to now the current results not being nearly as good, even though we're just a couple of days in, and also, as a reminder, the parses. So the actual amount of players dabbing into Mythic already are not nearly as many, even though, worth mentioning, Ret is still amongst the more popular options together with Beastmastery as well in the Mythic version of the raid, not just in heroic. Now, what could be interesting though, because after all, what little balance tuning we had this patch was exclusively about healers, right? The only other balance tuning we are getting in this season is in the forms of specs changing their tier set. The few specs who actually do change their tier set. The actual numbers being tuned are for healers. So in terms of the actual healing so far in the first few days of Mythic raiding, these are the results. Now, interestingly enough, we have in terms of HPS Preservation Evoker being at number 1. This is funny because the only other time Preservation Evoker has been the clear number 1 in terms of HPS was all the way back in the normal version of Vault of the Incarnates. So it's pretty funny that, well, a year and a half later, when we come back to Vault in its awakened version, Preservation Evoker is again having the highest HPS overall. It also seems like, unlike the start of Season 3, most priests, at least 2/3 of the priests, are not even trying, starting out with Discipline and staying straight up as Holy. Remember that Discipline was also nerfed this patch. It wasn't just the 13-something% nerf to Mistweaver, there was also a 10-ish% nerf in the raid for Discipline. These are the results so far captured from Warcraft logs. These are the ones straight from Archon, which catch more or less a similar thing. You have a group of healers very close to each other with a gap of 15-ish% of advantage for Preservation Evoker and Discipline Priest being far lower down. That's the current state of the healing effectiveness when it comes to raiding. Of course, when it comes to Mythic Plus, it is much less relevant. The HPS isn't even being tracked here because that's not even, it's not even a metric that relevant when it comes to the power of a healer in Mythic Plus. But these are the first preliminary results as far as the performance of the specs are included. We can finish with the presence so far of tank choices in the raid, even though we mentioned this one being an awakened season. The meta of tanks in the raid, it's not that relevant, but we do still have Blood Decay being the primary choice of tank in the raid, followed by Vengeance, which shows you how little relevance this season has for tanking, because Vengeance is a quite poor raid tank. Normally you would prefer Brewmaster or even Protection Paladin, but because there isn't really much to progress in the raid this season and Mythic Plus is overall more relevant, more tanks are going to be staying with the meta tank for Mythic Plus, so they also end up being quite popular in the raid as well, which is not something you would have seen last patch. Even if we go to a Mirdrasil and we move over to the tanks in this season where Vengeance was absolutely dominating, Prot was also ahead of Vengeance. Even if we go at the start of the season, the initial choice of tanking, same result. Not as much this season, where more tanks are sticking to Vengeance due to its already obvious popularity when it comes to Mythic Plus. So for now, these are the preliminary first couple of days results of spec choices in Season 4. We will see, of course, in the next couple of weeks as things get more clear, more and more specs get through completing their tier set, especially the ones who are going to be changing their tier set for this season, to see more of the results of the specs as well as the choices of the players as to what to play in this season. But for today, on this Thursday, this is all we have to show for the week. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these meta things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, looks like raining week is over. We have to start getting ready for the sun, unfortunately.